I'm Steve Feimer from the Criminal Justice Studies. Woo! Thank you very much. It's my honor tonight to present our speaker, Krista Herring-Garber. Ms. Garber is the Executive Director of the South Dakota Network Against Family Violence and Sexual Assault. Krista has worked in the area of domestic and sexual violence for 29 years. For 12 years, she's worked at the largest domestic violence shelter and crisis center in South Dakota. Krista has her master's degree in counseling and human resources and is a licensed social worker in South Dakota. Krista provides expert witness testimony in civil and criminal cases involving intimate partner violence and/or child abuse. Krista is the recipient of the Woman of Achievement Award by Business and Professional Women 2007, the Visionary Voice Award 2013, the FBI Director's Community Leadership Award in 2016, and recently received the Advocate in Action Award from the Minnehaha County Family Violence Council. Please help me welcoming Krista Herring-Garber.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here, and I'm going to let Sandy introduce herself. Sandy from Domestic Violence Safe Action Services right here in Vermillion, who has years of experience, is joining me today.
Well, not quite as many as you, Krista, but I've been working with victims for 25 years right here in this community. I'm the executive director, victims advocate, and pretty much catch-all kind of person here in Vermillion, but our agency serves 3 counties, Clay, Union, and Turner County, so we're stretched pretty thin sometimes, but we do the best we can to provide the services that are much needed and greatly required here with the community that we serve. When we look at the types of abuse that we experience right here in our small town, within our community, our county, our university, we're not going away anytime soon. I hate to say that. I love what I do, but I'd love to be put out of work. I was just telling Krista about that. And she understands very well what we're looking at, the types of things that we're trying to do here to provide services to those victims. So with that, I'll let Krista keep going.
Okay, I think the power went to sleep. I couldn't seem to.
Your battery died.
The battery died?
Yeah, it gave you a warning at the bottom of the screen a little while ago.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. That's good to know. And there isn't, so the PowerPoint is kind of a guide to just kind of talk tonight. I'm hoping that this can be more of an informal discussion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I do, that we work with across the state of South Dakota with agencies like Domestic Violence Safe Action Services. And hopefully you'll have some dialogue and just overall we could just discuss and talk tonight a little bit. So I would be really interested to find out who you are, where you're from, and if there's one thing that you would maybe like to discuss tonight, let us know what that is. Brianne is an MSW intern, Master's in Social Work intern who works in our office. Would you possibly, I see you have notes, would you write it down if they tell us something that they want us to talk about? Would you please? Thank you. So why don't we start over here? And where are you from? Who are you? And if there's anything specifically that you'd like us to talk about tonight.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm from Brandon.
From where? Brandon, okay.
Madeline, and I'm from Aberdeen.
I'm Sam, and I'm from Sioux Falls.
I'm Abby, and I'm from Vermillion. I'm Mandy, and I'm from Chamberlain.
New City, and I'm from Sioux Falls. I'm Karina, and I'm from Des Moines.
I'm Shanice, I'm from Jamaica.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Melissa, I'm from Wolsey, Iowa.
Okay.
I'm Will, I'm from
California.
Tony Yankton.
Josiah from Sioux City.
I'm Addison from Lawrence, Kansas.
Malachi from Sturgis, South Dakota.
Kendra from Dakota Dunes.
Haley from Sioux City.
Dan from Lake Preston. I'm Sean from San Francisco.
Great, okay, I'm not gonna remember all that, but it's interesting, all the different places that you're from. In South Dakota, of course, the agency that I work with, we work with all 66 counties and the 9 sovereign nations. So we travel a lot across the state of South Dakota providing various services. And I'm gonna be talking tonight about our organization and what we do. And at any point that anyone would have any questions, please ask. So it's answering any questions that you would have that you're thinking about, and also a little bit, so it can be interesting and a discussion and not just a PowerPoint. So, so the South Dakota Network Against Family Violence and Sexual Assault is a statewide coalition, and we work on issues of sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking. Family violence as a whole are issues that we work with across the state of South Dakota. We do that as a membership organization, as an association. And we do it as a very collaborative networking approach to try to develop services, change culture, and respond to help victims of violence and their families. The network was started in 1991. So some of the different things that we work on, the South Dakota Network, is public policy. How many of you are criminal justice majors? Okay. How about the rest of you? What are some of your majors?
Addiction studies.
Addiction studies, okay.
Social work.
Social work,
I work with at-risk kids, so I'm kind of all over the place. So it's a silver spike major-ish.
okay, great.
Political science.
What is it?
Political science.
Political science, okay. Anyone else, any other majors? So my bachelor's degree is in social work and psychology, and I have a master's degree in counseling, and end up spending a lot of time now working on public policy issues. So hopefully you all know the 3 branches of government, and you understand that whole process. I don't know that I can honestly say that I did when I was maybe your age, I have to admit. I do remember, so you're all much younger than I am, but do you remember how a bill becomes a law? Do you remember that song, "The Bill Becomes a Law"? Okay. On Saturday morning TV, "The Bill Becomes a Law." Okay, so that, actually I remembered a lot of that, and it taught me quite a bit. So what are the 3 branches of government? And what?
Executive.
Executive, okay. It's amazing the number of people that do not know the 3 branches of government. So we work on a lot of public policy issues, and how we go about doing that is, when I worked at the shelter for 12 years, and we worked individually with people in the shelter in the shelter setting, and usually that would be people that would be fleeing domestic violence home situations. So they would be in a home environment where there was physical abuse or sexual abuse or some type of violence going on that they would need to flee, and they would come and stay in the shelter setting, and then they would oftentimes bring their children. Children's Inn was very different than a lot of the other shelters because we had children that came and stayed by themselves through Child Protective Services and through the state system until they would maybe return home or go to a foster care home. So that we had emergency shelter services for children. And working with victims and families for 12 years, there were many times that they ran into many roadblocks. And some of the roadblocks that they would run into would maybe be because we didn't have a law on, to address what their needs were. So there might be a situation that, so for example, I referred to full faith and credit. I'll explain that for a minute. Does anyone know what a protection order is? Okay. So a protection order, for those that don't know, if someone is, I'll talk about a stalking protection order, for example. If someone is stalking me, harassing, has a malicious intent to cause harm to me on an ongoing basis, according to South Dakota law, I can go to the courts, I can get a temporary protection order signed by a judge if the judge agrees that it meets the criteria and I need this protection. So I would be the petitioner. The person that I would get the protection order against would be the respondent. I would get the protection order so that person would leave me alone and the judge would set the parameters within the protection order. And it's usually they would stay so many feet away, there wouldn't be contact, some of those various things that would be in the protection order. So I would get the protection order in South Dakota. Some of you are from Iowa. And Sioux City is just over there. I actually grew up in Akron, Iowa, so very close. Okay? So I have it in South Dakota. I have the protection in South Dakota because it happened in Vermillion where I needed to get the protection order. But it used to be that I would cross the state lines and go over to Iowa, and it wasn't any good there. So literally that person could follow me over to Iowa and harass me there, and it would start all over again. And it would be difficult for me to get a protection order in Iowa because it didn't happen in Iowa. It happened here in South Dakota. Now we have the same issue in much of South Dakota because of our sovereign nations. Do any of you live in a community where you have, you might be bordering a sovereign nation, a tribal area? You do. Some of our communities are what are kind of checkerboard communities. So you can be literally across the street, and if you cross the street now, you're in tribal land, and then you're in state land. So the same thing would apply. I would have a protection order in state land. I would cross over to go to tribal land, and my protection order wasn't any good. So South Dakota adopted full faith and credit, which was federal statute, and full faith and credit says, and I don't have the statute in front of me, but it's a valid protection order. They can see that it's valid because it's been signed by a judge. It has all the information in there. And actually law enforcement is given good faith protection that if they believe the protection order is valid, and it turns out to not be valid, the law says please honor the protection order and law enforcement is going to be protected. So they won't get into trouble if they find out it's not valid later. So what full faith and credit did is gave that protection order, it makes it valid in Iowa, it makes it valid in a sovereign nation. It might be a little different how the tribes recognize it because every tribal nation is different. But full faith and credit does allow that to be valid in tribal. And more importantly, I think, for the tribal orders to be recognized on state land. So that was one thing that our agency saw as a big gap and a huge need in South Dakota, specifically because we have 9 sovereign nations. And as I said before, we have checkerboard areas. So to ensure that the protection was provided and there was safety, that was a piece of legislation that we worked on for a long time. It actually took 3 years, third year in legislative session to get it passed. So the political process can be challenging.
When was that passed?
That's a good question. It was Governor Round signed it.
I don't know, but it's been in my time since that's been passed.
I would guess 2005. I'm guessing, I really don't know. But it was,
That might be about.
yeah, Governor Rounds is the one who signed it.
Some of the neighbors said it's mine. So I'm very, very interested in domestic violence on the reservation. I think my favorite lecture didn't say it was a favorite because it was such a terrible subject, but the speaker that I guess had the most impact was Sarah here. She spoke when she was.
And I would say because we're in Vermillion too, right here where, you know, we border Iowa, Nebraska, and people come from Minnesota and those places, that we recognize their protective orders as well with full faith and credit. So for us, it's really important for people who are coming from Iowa or from other states with the protective order that we recognize those as well.
Absolutely, from other states, it's very important. Another piece of legislation that we worked on in the last 10 years, which
So that's
It-
national?
full faith and credit is federal legislation. I believe it was passed in the Violence Against Women Act.
I think that may be true, but didn't we have to adopt it?
Yes, we did. The
South
state
Dakota?
had to adopt it, yes, which is oftentimes the case, yeah. And South Dakota was one of the last states to adopt it, but we did.
We did it.
Yes.
It's hard work, but we did it.
Yes. Interruption of emergency services. So domestic violence, we talk about domestic violence. I'm sure that you've all had this discussion, but I'll talk about and explain maybe a little bit about domestic violence. We talk about domestic violence as power and control. And domestic violence has various features that may go on in an intimate partner relationship that will overlap into other aspects of the family, child abuse, relationships between siblings, it can overlap. But most of the time when we talk about domestic violence, we're talking about intimate partner violence. The dynamics that we frequently see in intimate partner violence are something that we'll refer to as the Duluth model on the power and control wheel. We talk about different dynamics. There would be an abusive person may use intimidation over someone, their victim, intimidation, emotional abuse, and emotional abuse by many of the people that I worked with through the years would be referred to more as almost psychological torture. Because it really is brainwashing, making you think that all these things are wrong with you, you are to blame for everything that's happening, all those different things. So realistically, if you hear something about yourself all the time, eventually you believe it and you're convinced that you're horrible. So psychological torture, emotional abuse, minimizing, denying, and blaming. So everyone in the relationship has a tendency to minimize what's going on and deny that it's happening for various reasons. So if I put this up, can I bring it back down? There's the board behind me. There isn't a board. There's a board here. Okay, so there's a cycle of violence. I'm just going to draw it with my hands in front of you.
Just use your imagination.
Yes. So in the cycle of violence, there might be a period of time that you see the tension building. I'm drawing a circle here, okay? So the tension building period of time is maybe when there is emotional abuse, there's a lot of power and control things going on. It can look different for everyone, but there's a lot of tension in the home, there's a lot of anxiety. The people that live these situations know what it looks like, and they know what's going on, and they can feel it, okay? It varies. There isn't a time limit. It's going to vary for everyone, and every situation is going to be different. There is, though, some research that will say that as the relationship goes on, the time limit shortens, and it gets worse, and it gets more frequent. So there is a period of time the tension is building. Then we have the explosion, okay? So this is the circle, right? The explosion. The explosion is when you might have the physical abuse, definitely emotional abuse, frequently sexual abuse, sexual assault is even something that we don't hear about very often in the shelter setting immediately, because shelters deal with crises. And sexual abuse, sexual assault is one of the last things that people will often talk about because of the shame associated with that. But sexual abuse is very prevalent in intimate partner relationships
And marital
that are,
rape is-
where there's violence. What?
Marital rape is very difficult to prosecute, isn't it?
I think that's probably true. I actually just testified in a case not that long ago that was a marital rape case, but there was multiple charges. It was a very violent, brutal case, and there was kidnapping, aggravated assault, and multiple charges of violence that had occurred. The interesting thing about marital rape is that that was actually not changed in South Dakota law until the early 90s, I'm almost positive. It's fairly new because it was viewed to be fairly acceptable by some. I suppose that may still be the case, but obviously it is not acceptable ever. So, so we have the explosion, and that, when we do law enforcement training, we explain that that is oftentimes when law enforcement will be called. Do you know how many times the incident of domestic violence may occur before law enforcement is ever called?
A lot.
What?
I said a lot.
A lot. Just give me some numbers.
10.
10? More.
I'll say 20.
Higher.
50.
Higher. 70. 70 times is when there's been some incident of domestic violence that has occurred before law enforcement is called. Okay? So when law enforcement is called, we know that it's very serious. And at that point, most likely they're making the phone call because they are recognizing that someone is going to be seriously injured or killed. So law enforcement is called, and maybe not when there's the explosion, because unfortunately, sometimes the criminal justice system or the law enforcement response isn't helpful. Most of the time, I'd like to think it is, and we have wonderful law enforcement doing great work, but sometimes it doesn't work out well. And so then when there's the explosion, the victim will not call again. So let's say there's the explosion, and then we have the honeymoon period. So that's where I'm getting to this honeymoon period. And the honeymoon period, and this is Lenora Walker's work, the battered woman syndrome that I'm talking about, the battered woman. Anyway, and the honeymoon period is where there's hope that it's going to change. Things will get better. Now that I've called law enforcement, they're going to know that they have to stop. If they go to jail, it's just going to improve. If there's any intervention, things are going to get better. And there's hope that it's going to stop. Because when law enforcement are called, what do you think the victim wants to have happen?
They want it to stop.
They want it to stop. They don't necessarily want the person to go to jail. Why don't they want that person to go to jail?
Because they're in denial. They're in denial about the situation they're in. They're also enabling the attacker to continue to commit these acts of violence against them because of the brainwashing they went through.
Absolutely.
So I don't think they want this law enforcement to stop it. They want them to fix it. And that's not.
A lot of times they're financially dependent on the police.
Yes, economic abuse is another part of the dynamics that we talk about, and isolation. And so isolation, many times they will not allow the individual to work. And so they would not have financial resources to turn to. And economic abuse would be the control over what they do, how they spend their money, where they go, accounting for every penny, all those different things. It's that part of that control. So another reason that they wouldn't want the individual to go to jail is because if they go to jail and they are part of the breadwinner in the home, who's going to pay the rent? How are you going to pay the bills? How are you going to support the kids? What's going to happen? That's just the reality of what goes on. And it really doesn't matter your income level because, I mean, most of us grew up, in South Dakota have two-family two-family incomes. That's just the reality of the situation. So how are you gonna survive? What are you gonna do is a huge concern.
And I would just add to that, Krista, in that if your partner goes to jail, what is your partner going to be thinking while they're in jail? What are they going to be doing while they're in jail? What are they going to be concerned about when they get out?
How to get back at you.
I'm sorry, honey.
How to get back at you.
Get back at you. Yeah, right. They're going to be angry. And believe me, the victim knows this. And so oftentimes that will even stop them from contacting law enforcement as well. So fear.
Fear is huge.
It is.
Absolutely. Does anyone know, so I just explained this scenario. Let's say law enforcement is called. The individual is arrested. They go to jail for the night. Maybe they're charged with simple assault. If they're convicted of simple assault, first offense, how long are they probably gonna spend in jail afterwards? Yeah, they may not go to jail at all. They may get a day or two. They may get a fine. And more often than not, it's pled down to disorderly conduct. So what happens then with the victim who made that phone call? Nothing changed. And oftentimes they are,
And they're beaten again.
what?
They're attacked again.
They're attacked again. There may be more danger because now they're blamed for making that phone call, for putting their family through this, right? It's their fault, of course. The law enforcement that I work with, and I do a lot of law enforcement training across the state, but we train as a team. I have pictures in here of some of our trainers. We train as a team because we believe it's a coordinated effort to address domestic violence and sexual assault across the state. So I train with a law enforcement officer and a prosecutor, and then I represent the victim advocate. And many times law enforcement will say, as compared, domestic violence offenders as compared to, let's say, sexual assault offenders, sexual abuse offenders, sexual assault offenders will oftentimes admit something. Like sex offenders will admit something. They don't admit it all, but they admit some guilt. They admit that they did something. Domestic violence offenders never admit it. There's no accountability. It's crazy. I mean, it really is, because it is part of that control, that power and control that goes on, and it just doesn't happen that they admit it. And so I after doing this for 30 years now, I would agree that that is very, very much the case of what we see happen. So I can't speak for all of them, of course, but that is oftentimes what happens.
I support that. Absolutely.
So because it's the victim's fault, and that's what they tell them, and of course, you know, it's never anyone's fault if they're victim at the hands of someone who's causing abuse to them, but that's what they feel. That's part of the denying and minimizing blaming that goes on. So when I started to go through interruption of emergency services, when there is, during that explosion time, frequently something that we would see happen for years is the interruption of phone services or any type of assistance that the victim would be trying to do to get help. So now, it used to be that the phone would be ripped out of the wall. That was very common. You called the police, rip the phone out of the wall. Very, very common. Now, of course, what do we see? Broken cell phones, iPads, laptops,
Computers, any type of communication device.
any type of way that that individual victim, and it might be the children too, anyone in the home is summoning someone to come and help them. So it doesn't even have to be 911. I can be calling my mom to say that I need help. And if they pull that phone away and break it, then that's an interruption of emergency services. And that was legislation that's been passed in the last 10 years or so, and I know that it's used frequently because that is also a frequent occurrence that happens in domestic violence situations. So I'm going to go back to the dynamics one more time when I'm talking about the cycle here, so I make sure to cover all this. So we talked about using intimidation, coercion and threats of suicide, threats to harm someone else, threats to harm things that are important to the family, like animals and pets. Strong correlation with animals and pets being injured in domestic violence situations. I've worked with many situations through the years that sometimes the individual, no one has actually ever been touched in the home, but multiple pets have been killed or thrown against the wall, or just horrible, horrible stories of animals and pets being injured and killed. And so there's a strong correlation between animal abuse and child abuse. So coercion and threats, using emotional abuse, economic abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, and children. And let's talk about children. So children get caught in this cycle of domestic violence, and it definitely has an impact on their lives in many ways, and it can for a while have an impact. It doesn't have to forever, and it doesn't have to define them. So I say that because if any of you have had those experiences, it doesn't have to define your life, and you don't have to repeat those behaviors or those cycles. We hear that often, and I always kind of cringe when we say it because there might be some truth to it, but you know, there's so many law enforcement that I've met through the years because we do all the new law enforcement recruit training. And there's always a few law enforcement in the room that will share with us that they went through a lot of experiences like this in their lifetime, growing up in homes there was a lot of domestic violence going on. And that's why they chose to go into law enforcement, to make a difference. And they didn't want to see that cycle continue. So children are oftentimes so caught in the middle here and can be used as pawns in the situation. It's very difficult for children. And even after the relationship, the parent relationship may end and they may get divorced or they're no longer together, then many times we see ongoing challenges with custody and visitation. And we see that go on. Does anyone know why that would continue on even after the relationship has ended? The control continues, absolutely. It just will change. It will look differently. But the control will continue if the individual that's causing the harm doesn't get assistance and help, that control will continue and will look differently. So it will go on many times into the child custody and visitation and becomes very, very difficult and continues to be very difficult for the children in that situation. And then the other piece that we talk about many times on the power control wheel is called using male privilege. And it's interesting because I'll talk about it, but as I talk about the victims, sometimes you'll hear us refer to the victims being female, the males being the offenders. That's not always the case. And 85% of the time, actually, I think, statistically, they say that men are the offenders in the relationship and 50% females are the victims, or no, the other way around. What did I say? 85% females are the victims and 15% male. I think that was some of the more recent statistics. But there's been really such a change over the years in some of the things that we're seeing with the gender roles, the differences in different types of relationships, and gender roles meaning we have more and more women that are fighting back. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily domestic violence. It can be that they're just fighting back more. Because there's 3 choices that a victim would have in a domestic violence situation. What would be the 3 choices that they would have?
Run.
They would run, leave, fight,
Give
or
up. Give up.
submit. Those would be the 3 choices. And it's after doing this for many years, we're seeing more and more situations that victims are fighting back, and they're fighting back sooner. So it's changing things a little bit, but it still makes it a very, very volatile and dangerous situation. So, so we talk about male privilege, and on the wheel, what the male privilege basically means in those situations where the male is the offender, and the female is the victim, the male privilege really means, is that your example?
It's the power
Yeah.
control wheel.
It's a power and control wheel.
Okay.
That's good.
So the example would be that there would be they would use that as saying, I am the head of the household, I am in charge, I can tell you to do these things because of that. Now, there are different cultures and religious beliefs that have very specific gender roles, and that is okay as long as both partners, both people in the relationship are okay with that, are comfortable with that, that that's the way they want it to be. But when the male privilege is used as violence against that individual, that is not okay. And that's what they talk about when they talk about using male privilege. So another piece of legislation that we worked on is the domestic violence definition changes. And what that domestic violence definition usually means that it had to be between, until 2014 when it changed, the legislative session 2014, to fall under the domestic violence definition, you had to be related to the person, have a child together, or live together. And we left out some relationships with that definition, didn't we? There were some relationships that were being left out. Dating was a huge part that was left out. And even if the person, they're actually having a child together and the woman is pregnant, but they haven't married and they don't live together, we also left out those individuals. So the domestic violence definition changed and included now significant romantic relationships if you don't meet any of the other criteria. What is a significant romantic relationship? It's the discussion we have all the time with law enforcement. So tell me, what is a significant romantic relationship to you? What would you say is a significant romantic relationship? There is not case law, I'm told, I'm not an attorney, yet to define this, but tell us what you think it is. What would be significant? Sex, okay. One time? Okay. Unless you have other times together and other pieces of the relationship, law enforcement may not agree with you. But it could be sexual assault, definitely, one time. But in domestic violence, we're looking for more of a pattern.
They've gone on dates.
You go on dates, okay?
Say it'd be an exclusive relationship.
Exclusive, Facebook exclusive, I don't know. That's what somebody said yesterday in a training I was at law enforcement. They asked if they're Facebook.
Probably the length of the relationship.
The length of the relationship. So maybe you don't live together, but do you have any of your belongings at that person's house, your partner's house? Are your belongings there? Do you leave a toothbrush? How often do you stay there?
Why does it have to be classified as a relationship in the first place?
Domestic violence?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so what happens in domestic violence relationships? That is a great question. I'll tell you why they qualify it. Because if it's a domestic violence relationship, there's certain laws that come into play immediately. Because of what happens in domestic violence and everything that we're talking about. So there's some laws that it clicks. So if you guys are dating and you assault her, okay, right? But you didn't fit the criteria before, you wouldn't be tagged as a domestic relationship. And so as tagged as a domestic relationship, immediately you could get a protection order. Before, unless you fit the criteria for stalking, you may not be able to get a protection order. Now you can get a domestic protection order. The second thing that would happen is once you would be arrested, there's immediate no contact order that goes into place. So you can't go to jail and decide that you're going to call her and tell her to drop the charges without getting into trouble. Okay, that's a no contact order that goes into place immediately. And unless it's lifted, that goes into place. And the reason that goes into place is exactly what I just explained, because that's what would happen. And why would that happen?
Because the abuser.
Intimidation, witness tampering, and that control continuing, right? To get it to drop. Okay, so, and then with the domestic tag also says, according to federal law, that if there is a protection order, and state if they write it on the protection order, according to federal law, if there's a protection order in place, that individual loses their firearms privileges. And according to federal law, if you are convicted of a domestic violence assault, you lose your firearms privileges for the rest of your life, according to federal law. State law says after a year conviction, you can apply to get them back, but federal law supersedes state law. So if you would apply to get your firearms back, you could maybe hunt in South Dakota, but if you ever go and like apply to get a gun, you're going to show up in the firearms list, you know, the federal list, and they won't sell it to you. That's what happens. So, because federal law supersedes state law. So those are some of the, there's also enhancements, which means that if you have 3 simple assault domestics in a 10-year period of time, it becomes a class 6 felony, I think. Or is it aggravated assault in 3 years becomes a felony?
And then the next,
Okay.
and aggravated then becomes a class 5.
A class 5, thank you, you're right, absolutely. So so the enhancements come into play when it's tagged domestic. And then there's 3 disorderlies in a 10-year period, and I don't remember what it is, but that's what ends up happening. Yeah, lawyer things. But it's actually all the legislation we passed, I should know, because we worked on all that legislation and brought it forward to the legislature and asked legislature to sponsor the bills, and then they did pass the enhancements. So the domestic violence definition now does allow for dating relationships. And that was a big deal for us to finally get that passed, because there was a lot of concerns about, well, what if she says that they're dating and he says that they're not dating, and there was a lot of concerns about how to figure out how to approach it. Our concern, of course, overall is safety. It used to also be now that the victims can offer impact statements and have a right to do that. That's another thing that's passed. And there's more and more legislation that we've worked on, I guess, through the years. I don't know, trying to think of it. Do you think of anything, Sandy?
What you kind of touched on a little bit was the no contact with the victim once you're in jail or right after that for a period of time, which I think allows for the victim to time to get an order of protection in place before that no contact order is lifted, which is really a very short time. It's only a few weeks that the no contact order is in place. And no contact is not the same as a protection order, which I think some people are getting confused about.
Yeah, they're different, yeah, absolutely. And that no contact order goes into place when they're in custody. Sometimes it is lifted, we don't like it when it's lifted, but sometimes it is by the judge. Okay, so any questions about legislation? So that's one of the things that we work on, thank you, is passing the legislation. The other thing that we actively do in our organization is we search for funding. And a lot of the funding that we receive comes directly from the federal government. So we will find out what the needs are in South Dakota. We listen to the people that we work with, and we try to create services and respond accordingly. So for example, in September, we were either received directly or were a part of 6 federal grants. And over the next 3 years, we'll bring over $6 million to the state of South Dakota. And yes, and there's a lot that's been going on for quite a while, that there's been a lot of funding. So we are part of creating that. So some of the grants that we administer, we actually work with the Attorney General's office or the Division of Criminal Investigation. We administer the grant for them. We have one grant that we administer that covers a domestic violence detective and 2 deputies in the Sioux Falls, Minnehaha County, and Lincoln County area. And they work together as a coordinated team investigating domestic violence cases. There's also an advocate that's funded on that team to be able to work with the victims and be able to respond accordingly, offering resources and services and other things like that. So that's one of the grants that we fund and work on. We also have some sexual assault prevention efforts that we fund. And the sexual assault prevention efforts do date safe training. Okay, so what that basically means is, like right now, we are going to train as many people as we can, but hopefully 50 people in the state of South Dakota. Right now we have 7 tribes signed up to come as well, so hopefully it will be a good representation of the state, including individuals involved in schools, teachers, counselors, and others. We train them on this evidence-informed best practices approach, which is, it's Mike Domish is the person that is the speaker and the one who developed it. Can I Kiss You? He has a book. He's came to South Dakota at different times. I don't know if he's ever been to USD. I know he was at Mount Marty not that long ago. And so he's going to be doing the training. So they'll train actually for 2 days people that will become certified to go back to their communities and offer this training. And it is primarily for K through 12. This training will be. And the focus is really talking about sexual assault prevention efforts. So some of the things that we have found through all of our research, working with the Centers for Disease Control in South Dakota, for example, and I didn't bring it with me because I don't have the ability to share it yet, but we have discovered that, for example, we're hearing that a lot of people in the middle school and high school age range that have completed some of the surveys do not really understand what consent is. So how many of you know the age of consent in South Dakota? 16. But a lot of the people that we have presented to other prevention activities and surveys and other information that has been completed really indicated that they did not know what the age of consent was. And they really felt like consent, sexual assault was when somebody is fighting back. If they're not fighting back, then it's really not sexual assault. Which really, actually really surprised us. That was some of the information that came out. Do you remember other pieces of that, Brianne? Yeah, there's quite a bit of data that's coming out and so we're trying to respond accordingly. We have some areas of the state that are reporting there's no sexual assault services, there's no sexual assault prevention, so we're trying to respond accordingly and go directly to those areas of the state to make sure that they're invited to the trainings, that there's services that are offered, that we're trying to talk about. And we've just kind of started this process with CDC, so it's really in the infancy stage for us as we're developing services and some type of response. So it's one of the many projects that we work on, I guess. Questions?
Could you explain the law enforcement recruit training that you're doing?
Yes, so law enforcement, we have worked with the Division of Criminal Investigation and the South Dakota Department of Social Services, and they have actually funded through the Stop Violence Against Women Act since 2000 to provide law enforcement training across the state of South Dakota on specifically domestic violence and also sexual assault, and then we also work on other areas. Sometimes it's strangulation, not choking, strangulation. Sometimes it's stalking and elder abuse. So there's other topics that we train on, but specifically it's been domestic violence. So we will train all the new recruits at the Law Enforcement Academy. I believe it's like quarterly. I think we go 3 or 4 times a year. And we do a whole day of law enforcement training, and we always train with a law enforcement officer and a prosecutor. I am not an attorney. I work a lot on state statutes, but clearly that's not my role, and I've never prosecuted, nor have I ever been a law enforcement officer. But we have very close relationships and work together, and we train together. And so we train all the new recruits. The first full day is on 8 hours of activities. We are very focused on problem-based learning. So we don't lecture and use PowerPoint for the entire day. We actually do scenario training. We give them real examples. We go through different protection orders, and we don't necessarily give them answers so they can work through it because they have already worked on the law and they have the laws in front of them, the state statutes. The second day, we break them into 2 groups and we do role plays all day. And that's all we do, and they're real situations. We take them very seriously. I could tell you lots of scenarios that we do, but and so we do scenario training, which is very helpful. We always get a lot of positive feedback about that. It's a lot different than when it's on paper and when you actually are in the middle of the situation. So we try to take real situations that people share with us, and of course, we're bound by confidentiality, so it would never be disclosed, any confidential pieces. But we just take some of the concept that's happened from that scenario and we replay it with law enforcement. So I can easily say that I get arrested probably 6 times a year at least. When I get handcuffed, sometimes I've been thrown down to the ground. Totally serious, I go home with marks on my arms because they pick me up and haul me out. Depending on whatever's going on in the scenario, it's very serious, the thing that we do. When we've trained in tribal areas, we also try to bring someone who knows the federal laws and the jurisdictional issues. So then they will come with us.
I also found it interesting that there's only 2 certifications that law enforcement have to keep up. And one is their firearm certification, like qualifying at the range. They have to do that every 2 years, and then they have to come do the domestic violence training
Every 4 years. That's the only mandatory ongoing training for law enforcement in the state of South Dakota.
I found that very interesting on a few different levels.
And domestic violence, that training is mandatory every 4 years because domestic violence is not like any other crime that they're going to investigate and work on. It's very, very different. We spend a lot of time talking about the predominant aggressor and how to determine the predominant aggressor when they're called to a domestic violence situation. And I just heard this yesterday at a training I was at, that the prosecutor talked about that this is the one crime in South Dakota where you can, you're supposed to and encouraged by state statute to consider the relationship between the parties. So how long has this gone on? What is the cycle of violence? How many times has there been physical violence? Those are all considerations that law enforcement are supposed to consider by state statute when they are determining the predominant aggressor in that relationship to make an arrest that night.
So I'm the law enforcement officer, and I've come to your house, 72 times. And I am sick to death of dealing with you, not dealing with him, and not dealing with her. How should they respond to that?
Well, we talk about this because there's a lot of frustration, and as advocates, we also get frustrated.
Sure.
And I can also say that I have a family member that has been in this situation off and on for a long time. And so it's very, very difficult what you can and cannot say. Because I want my family member that I care very much about to be safe, and I want her children to be safe, but I also don't want to say things that she's not gonna contact me anymore. So we say to law enforcement, your response every time, including the 13th time, is very important. That might be the time that they're ready to leave. Your response is critical, and we might say things like, I'm afraid for your safety. This is very detrimental to your children. Can I refer you to Sandy? Maybe Sandy would call you. Is that okay? There are protection orders that would be available. I know that you didn't keep the last one. That's okay. I understand that. But you might be able to go and apply again. We encourage you to talk to Sandy or whoever else. So we give an assignment to law enforcement that at the end of the first day, they need to call the advocate. They need to call their local shelter crisis center, find out their services, tell them, and they have to report the next day.
I have to tell you, the training is working because I'm getting calls from law enforcement officers. And I recognize that that was partly what, the impact that you had at the training.
And that was actually the idea from the law enforcement officers.
It's really great for building relationships.
Yeah.
We're concerned about law enforcement officers too, because it's one of the most dangerous calls we're gonna go.
So that response is really critical. It can be frustrating, but we also, that's why we spend so much time talking about this cycle of violence, because it is a cycle, it can continue. We also know that it's really difficult for people to get out and make that break and leave for many different reasons. And we also encourage, if there is people that would be causing the harm or potentially be an offender, to get help, to go to treatment. If it's batters intervention programs, which is grounded in power and control, is the best form of treatment and counseling for someone who is a domestic violence offender. But any type of help is help, and so we strongly encourage that as well, because that's the best thing for the family unit. If everyone, the violence can stop, it stops, so.
And anytime a victim has interaction with a person who's in authority, positive interaction means that they will call you again when they are in trouble. And, the ultimate would be if you got called and, the victim happened to be in a very serious injury situation or possibly dead. So we don't want that to happen. We want the victim to get as much help and resources as are available from law enforcement, through law enforcement, because you're the authority figure at that scene.
Absolutely. That was a great question, though, because it comes up all the time when we talk about it. And that 13th time might be the time that it's going to make the difference. But the alternative is, and it used to be this way, law enforcement wouldn't go. In the old days, because they've been around for a long time, they wouldn't respond anymore. And people ended up dead. And it still happens because victims stop calling if it's not helping. So that's what we're trying to change that. We're trying to change that system. We're trying to work on a response that's different, and make sure that people are held accountable and get help. So I know that we're almost out of time, so I'm going to whiz through this a little bit. Those are some of our law enforcement trainers. Lauren McManus is with the Sioux Falls Police Department, and Mike Moore is with the Vido County State's Attorney's Office prosecutor, and Tom Woolman is a Lincoln County prosecutor, and then we have two from Pennington County. a prosecutor and a law enforcement officer, and then you can see me, and then the woman standing by me was Mrs. South Dakota a few years ago, and her platform was domestic violence because she had lived in a domestic violence home for many years. So we try to have survivors come and share their story if they're comfortable doing that and they're safe doing that. And they like to do that specifically for law enforcement, because many times law enforcement actually are their heroes. They made that big difference to them when they did respond, because we have some great responses of law enforcement. Some, you know, we still need some work to do, but we're all human, but actually that's improved a lot through the years. That's our staff. That was actually, we're all dressed down because that was a day that we went to one of our shelters and we helped them clean out. We filled 2 dumpsters full, did a lot of yard work, and just redid the whole shelter that day. But we work, this is other pictures of our staff. We really work together as a team. That's very important to us. We could spend a whole nother, I don't know how long, talking about trauma. So when you talk about victims not leaving, victims impacted in the decisions they make, you know, trauma looks very different to everyone, and you know that there's trauma that has been experienced. And there also, we talk a lot about vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue for individuals that do this work, because after a while, when you hear all the stories and see all the horrible things, you get a little tainted. And I go through periods of times that I have nightmares, and I have to deal with that and address it appropriately for myself. And I'm not even doing direct services anymore, but I do read police reports, I testify in court, I hear many advocates and others that are calling, needing assistance and help. And the stories are horrendous, and they're real, and they're all around us all the time. Yes?
Can you talk about the importance for future social workers and law enforcement to receive consistent counseling?
So that's a great point. I mean, counseling, whether it be counseling, support, you know, mentoring, there's a lot of different things that you can call it. I personally love counseling because for me personally, I'm paying someone and they have to listen to me for an hour, and then I don't feel guilty for talking. That's how it feels to me. I like to go and just get it all out and talk. So counseling is really good. I think the really important thing is that it's really important that you're healthy. And what that looks like, I think that we all kind of know what that looks like. Maybe we don't. But healthy meaning you're taking care of yourself. So I know when I start to have bad dreams that I need to address that. I need to take some time off. I exercise. That's how I alleviate my stress and deal with things. Other people have other ways of approaching it. As a team and our staff, we talk about triggers, which I did a horrible job because I did not do a trigger alert at the beginning of this presentation, I'm sorry. But we talk about triggers, that if anyone is triggered and how to respond in our office, and we're very open to that response. And we support a healthy environment. So if we have someone in our office that starts to go to counseling, absolutely we're going to support that they take that time and they go to the counseling and they go to the appointments, and we support that, and we want them to be healthy. And many times also people that work in our field or similar fields have had experiences, and that's what brings them to it. And so we talk about those triggers. And I think we have a very healthy environment. So would you agree?
Self-care is definitely a high priority.
Self-care is a high priority. Family is very important. Family comes first. Self-care is very important. However that looks for the individual. If you're not healthy, you will not be able to help anybody else. You'll do more damage. Seriously. Very, very important. And hopefully you have relationships with people that will be able to tell you when you're not healthy. You can get help we all go through periods of time in life when we need that. You can get help, you can get stronger, you can get better, but we want you to be healthy so you can help others, if that's what you're feeling. Okay. So I talked about collaboration, spent a lot of time talking about social change, oppression, racism, poverty, all those different pieces that are very contributing factors, strong contributing factors when we talk about domestic violence, sexual violence, the inability for people to get help. Oh, there you go. There it is, power control wheel.
Voila.
We also have a project that we're working with 2 disability organizations in our state, the South Dakota Coalition for Citizens with Disability and Communication Services for the Deaf, as we're trying to develop an infrastructure for services specific to individuals with disabilities and deaf individuals in South Dakota. So this is a power control wheel for the deaf community. It's an example of that. This is a power control wheel in the dating community or the teenage partners, teenage community. And I think I'm out of my time here, so. So questions, anyone have any questions? Yes.
So do you believe there's any hope for the abuser to be rehabilitated and have healthy relationships?
Yes, I absolutely think there's hope. If I didn't think there was hope, then I would be in the wrong field. Because I think that people can change and people can get support and we unfortunately, we haven't been as successful as developing services for people that have been identified as domestic violence offenders. And honestly, part of it is because we don't have any funding for it. Can't find federal funding that will pay for it or state funding. That's why we've struggled with it. But I absolutely think that there's hope. And yeah.
I think personally the key is to create social change. Make it not okay. It is not okay to harm someone you love.
It's not.
So that's a really valid point. I mean, so there's a whole bunch of services for the victim, and obviously there needs to be hope. But shouldn't there be just as much services for the attacker to stop that circle from continuing? I mean, if you're not gonna treat him as soon as he gets out of jail, he's the same guy. While she's been going through these maybe growth changes where she's realizing how all of that.
Yes, go
So
ahead.
with that, I think that that's going to be a change coming with the rehabilitation of drug users. Does that make sense? As opposed to lock them up and punish them? I feel like that's
Oh, I
going
see
to
what
be
you're saying.
part of that movement of bringing treatment
Sure.
to the offenders
Sure.
rather than, treating the crime.
Sure, that is the next.
I mean,
step.
obviously, I think it'll probably be, risk reduction, maybe, sort of trying to get in early with those first offenses, and then go through some sort of treatment program, and then, know like offenses, and then it can go away, sort of like drug court or
So you're doing
DUI.
that in combination with like a primary prevention program with the kids?
And that's just where I see it moving for the state of South Dakota, but I don't know if I have any grounds to say that.
So I think you're
That's what we-
exactly right. I think you're gonna see a shift nationally.
Is that happening, just out of curiosity, and I should know this, on the West Coast? Are they doing that because of the progressiveness with their dual diagnosis and all of that?
I don't know for sure. What I can tell you is when we start to go to national trainings now, we're hearing more of an emphasis, not so much trying to change the culture a little bit, and so shifting away from the victim dynamics when we talk about power and control and what the victim's going through, but focusing on what the offender is doing and why they're doing this. And so for all of you, you can be a part of that social change right now. So when we talk about domestic violence, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I'm sure many of you thought, why does the victim stay? but we need to change that and start talking about why is that offender doing that? Why are they doing that behavior? That needs to be the shift that happens. As we make that shift, there's also gonna be a lot more attention, I think, and we're seeing that, and we're being told that on the national level, for more funding and assistance for individuals that have been convicted of crimes or identified as abusive individuals to get help, to get treatment, to stop that. Okay, so, yeah. Anything else?
You're welcome to grab anything you'd like on the table there. If you didn't get a magnet, please feel free to pick one up. Or you want more, help yourself.
Well, let's thank Kristen and Sandy for coming down and sharing their insights with us. We appreciate it very much.